60 nuclear missiles, fighter jets, and military trucks. So we were still off. There were 60 nuclear missiles on the ground in Cuba during the entire crisis. How many do we ever see the most? About 40 or so. Okay, but there are actually 60. So in July of '62, 85 Soviet ships left Russia. They were carrying Russian soldiers, 60 nuclear missiles, fighter jets, and military trucks. Now, once these Russian ships entered Caribbean waters, the United States began flying over the Soviet ships and taking photos. Once the photos were developed, American officials recognized the fighter jets and military trucks, but did not recognize the missiles. Why? Because they didn't put them on the deck, they put them underneath. Okay, so it wasn't like we weren't watching them. Well, once they got to Cuba, these Russian soldiers offloaded these missiles early in the morning while it was dark, so nobody could see them do it. And they even made Soviet soldiers wear civilian clothing, and they were not permitted to speak Russian while they were in Cuba at all. That was the deal. Well, it was on August 29th that a U-2 spy plane shot photographs of Cuba, and these photographs clearly showed surface-to-air missiles being constructed. Now, a surface-to-air missile, and you'll see it in the video, is one that's on the ground that shoots up towards a hot target like an airplane. And the surface-to-air missiles that were being constructed on August 29th was the missile that shot down Major Rudolph Anderson. It didn't show missiles on the ground like they did earlier or later in October, but did show these SAM sites, or surface-to-air missiles. And these are missiles, and you'll see them, that when a plane would fly over and they would detect a plane, they would shoot these missiles up, and the radar would take them to the hot airplane and shoot it down. Okay? Now, the next U-2 flight was the one that happened on October 14, 1962, that set the stage for the Cuban Missile Crisis. So can you kind of see why they put missiles in Cuba in the first place? That's why they did it. Okay, that's going to take us to our last couple subtopics here. First one is the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. The Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. And this kind of has to do with the speech at American University and a philosophy change, not only between the United States and Soviet Union, but the Soviet Union is going to change their attitude a little bit with the United States. And it became evident to Premier Khrushchev after the Cuban Missile Crisis that he and Kennedy thought a lot alike, that they should try to get along with each other better than be adversaries. So Khrushchev stated he would be in favor of a treaty to ban the testing of nuclear missiles. He would be in favor of a treaty to ban the testing of nuclear missiles. How many nuclear missile tests did we have during the crisis that you can remember? Well, actually there were 2. But there were 2, and he's thinking that didn't cause anything but tension. So let's ban these nuclear tests. The United States was very much in favor of that, obviously. So on July 25th of 1963, about 4 months prior to the president's assassination, the Soviet Union, the United States, and Great Britain all signed a treaty that promised to end all nuclear test explosives in 3 areas of the world. So on July 25th, 1963, the Soviet Union, the United States, and Great Britain signed a treaty that promised to end all nuclear test explosions in the Earth's atmosphere, in outer space, and underwater. On July 25th, 1963, the Soviet Union, the United States, and Great Britain signed a treaty that promised to end all nuclear test explosions in the Earth's atmosphere, in outer space, and underwater. And this agreement became known in the Kennedy administration as the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, and probably goes down as Kennedy's greatest accomplishment as president legislatively. Does that make sense? On things that were passed. Okay? People remember him a lot for the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. Okay, last thing we're going to talk about is I want to tell you a little bit more about Kenneth O Donnelly. He played such a crucial role in the Cuban Missile Crisis. I want you to know a little bit more about the man. Okay? And you write down what you feel is important, or listen, whatever you want to do. Kind of interesting is Kenneth O'Donnell was actually born Patrick Kenneth O'Donnell. He was actually born Patrick Kenneth O'Donnell, and he was born in 1924. He was born Patrick Kenneth O'Donnell in 1924. And O'Donnell's dad was the head football coach at Holy Cross University and also served as the athletic director there. So O'Donnell's father was the head football coach at Holy Cross University. It's a private Catholic college. And he was also the athletic director. His name was Cleo O'Donnell. Well, Kenneth O'Donnell actually served in the U.S. Army Air Corps during World War II. Do you remember when President Kennedy said you used to make a living looking down bomb sites? What do you think? Do you remember that in the video? The reason he referred to that is because O'Donnell had served in the U.S. Army Air Corps during World War II. And he did used to look down bomb sites for a living. But he didn't know the Kennedys during this time. He met the Kennedys after World War II when he went to Harvard University. And he first met Bobby and then met his brother John. And you remember in the movie he was talking about, when I first met your brother, I didn't really get him at first. He was kind of sizing him up because Bobby's the one that he was better friends with, and Bobby was the one that he met first at Harvard and then later was introduced to John Kennedy. Well, O'Donnell and Bobby became very close friends as a result of their Harvard years. They continued to be friends. And O'Donnell went to Boston College Law School, but he didn't really pan out that well. So he attended Boston College Law School, didn't pan out. And so he ended up working as a salesman for a paper company in Boston in 1951. He began to work in a paper company in Boston in 1951. And during the time he was working for that paper company, he helped with John Kennedy's senatorial campaign. Remember, Bobby was always the president's campaign manager for the House and the Senate and the presidency. Well, Kenneth O'Donnell assisted Bobby in helping John Kennedy become elected to the Senate. And he continued with the Kennedy administration and then walked into the White House with the Kennedys when President Kennedy was elected president. And it was at that time, just before Kennedy's election, that he changed his name, legally reversed his name. Instead of Patrick Kenneth O'Donnell, he changed it to Kenneth Patrick O'Donnell. And he did that just prior to the president's election. What do you think he did in the presidential campaign? What was he? Same thing? What did he do when he was the president? Appointment secretary. He was the same thing for Senator Kennedy when he ran for the presidency. He set up his appointments. Okay, he was his scheduler. Well, like I mentioned, in 1961, O'Donnell followed the Kennedys into the White House, serving as President Kennedy's special assistant and appointments secretary. And he was perhaps President Kennedy's top advisor, other than the president's brother. And you know what they called all of Kennedy's closest advisors and friends? The Irish Mafia. They referred to him as the Irish Mafia. And this would be Lawrence O'Brien, who you'll hear more about, and David Powers, who you'll hear more about, and Kenneth O'Donnell. They were members of the president's closest advisors. They were known as the Irish Mafia. Now, you know, every president has a chief of staff, right? Well, Kenneth O'Donnell really was the chief of staff for President Kennedy, although President Kennedy never ever appointed anyone to that position. But what O'Donnell did in the White House, other than the appointment secretary, is he really did serve as the president's chief of staff, although Kennedy never appointed one officially. Now, we'll get into this later, but the Vietnam War was starting to rumble during Kennedy's presidency. And O'Donnell was an outspoken critic of any American involvement in Vietnam. And he encouraged the president to stay out of Vietnam. And in an interview with Walter Cronkite before his assassination, just shortly before, Kennedy made the comment to Walter Cronkite that it was, in the end, it was their war to win, meaning the South Vietnamese. And a lot of historians believe that Kennedy would have never gotten the Americans into Vietnam like Johnson did, not even close. And so O'Donnell was an advocate of staying out. In November of 1963, O'Donnell was involved in the organization of the presidential trip to Dallas, Texas. And sadly enough, it kind of gives me goosebumps. On November 22nd, 1963, during the parade route in Dallas, O'Donnell was seated in the Secret Service car with David Powers immediately behind the presidential limousine, and they witnessed close hand the brutal assassination of their friend. They could see from here to the video the president's head exploding upon the third shot. Witnessed the whole thing from me to the video camera. Both he and David Powers. Well, after the president was assassinated, he obviously didn't stay in the Kennedy cabinet and go into the Johnson cabinet, and he decided to run for the Democratic nomination to become governor of Massachusetts, and he lost. Okay? So he was seeking the Democratic nomination to become governor of Massachusetts, and he was defeated in the primary, and so he did not have a chance. What do you think O'Donnell did in 1968? 68. What did he do for a living? You have to kind of, we haven't got that far. He was Bobby Kennedy's presidential campaign manager when he ran for president, and didn't witness it close up, but witnessed the assassination of Bobby in June of 1968 when he was campaigning in Los Angeles. He's seen some bad stuff, has he not? Watched both of his best friends be assassinated. Well, in 1976, O'Donnell and David Powers got together and published a book entitled, I think I told you this, Johnny, We Hardly Knew Ye, Memories of John Fitzgerald Kennedy. They got together, wrote that book. Here's the book right here. In 1976, that was published. They did well with that book. Unfortunately, on September 9th of 1977, just a year later, O'Donnell died. The effects of alcoholism. He died, the effects of alcoholism. In 1998, his daughter, Helen O'Donnell, wrote a book and published it called A Common Good, The Friendship of Robert F. Kennedy and Kenneth P. O'Donnell, copying kind of off the book that her father and David Powers on the memories of John Kennedy. She wrote the book, here it is here, A Common Good, The Friendship of Robert F. Kennedy and Kenneth O'Donnell. So she kind of piggybacked on there in honor of her father and wrote a book about the relationship between Kenneth O'Donnell and Robert. Okay, we are going to video up tomorrow. We're going to watch the last part of 13 Days. I'm also going to show you that speech that is due, or that is of American University, the peace speech. I want these handouts of part 3 completed by tomorrow so we can go over them after the videos and move on. Okay? Emily, did I give you one of those? Part 3. Okay, we'll go over those tomorrow. Now, just a little bit of a hint, I would have all 3 ready to roll tomorrow. All 3 ready to roll tomorrow. Okay, and I'll give you your biography topics tomorrow on who you need to write on.